Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next lesson. So, this one's going to be a brief overview of the Reconstruction Era, which was the years immediately following the U.S. Civil War, which wrapped up militarily in 1865. So, let's get started. So, what exactly was Reconstruction? What are we talking about when we say the Reconstruction Era? We're talking about a period of rebuilding in the U.S. post Civil War, and you can see in this photo in the background the ruins of a southern city. And this is probably Richmond, Virginia. But there are many places throughout the South that look just like this. And obviously, the US, especially in the South, was going to have to physically rebuild. But even in the North, that didn't experience as much physical damage, was going to have to rebuild. And you must understand that this period generally refers to the end of fighting in 1865 up until 12 years later, the withdrawal of Union soldiers from former Confederate states in 1877. So that's the period that we're talking about. And this was the reconstruction of government, this was the reconstruction of society, of the economy. Remember, the South had depended on slavery, and even some northern states had to rely on it and had slavery at some points. So, because it was such an important part of their economic well-being at the end of the Civil War, slavery, legally didn't exist anymore. So their economies had to be rebuilt and changed, and there were very different ideas about what the government and about was going to do, and about society and what needed to happen in order to rebuild the United States. And these ideas would be played out and argued over in government and in society, and it'd be pretty heated as well. So let's first focus on the politics. First, so President Abraham Lincoln had favored a lenient Reconstruction plan. He would have allowed readmission of the southern states to the United States pretty quickly. However, President Lincoln was assassinated, and when he was assassinated, a group of Republicans who were in Congress, known as the Radical Republicans, um, and they were radical Republicans because some of the ideas they had, like equality between whites and blacks, may have scared a lot of people and made them, and many people considered them radical for that reason. These radical Republicans, they wanted to punish the South for having left the United States, having attempted to leave the United States, and they wanted to punish them for having owned slaves, and for, in their eyes, having caused the Civil War. And they blamed it in particularly on the slaveholders, and they wanted African Americans to be made full citizens, and they wanted male suffrage so that all African American males should receive the right to vote. So, as we know, Andrew Johnson became president after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and he also favored a lenient Reconstruction policy, but with some very important differences between himself and Lincoln. He did not care about protecting the former slaves, about protecting their rights now as citizens of the United States. He also required former Confederate leaders. Um, he required former Confederate leaders to apply for a presidential pardon, right? And so basically, they had to get a pardon directly from the president. They basically had to go to the White House and beg the president of the United States, who was himself a Southerner. Andrew Johnson was from the state of Tennessee, and they had to beg him for a pardon. So Andrew Johnson was kind of using this opportunity to please his own ego. And Johnson also vetoed various congressional acts that would have supported the former slaves, the 4 million now free African Americans who needed a lot of support in getting a new start on life in this new freedom that they have. So this is a cartoon on the right from the era that shows a caricature of Andrew Johnson, and in the middle, right? And he's hand in hand with two small children who represent the Civil Rights Act and represent the newly freed African Americans, freed from slavery, and showing how, like in Hansel and Gretel, the father was not actually kind to them. He was going to leave them in the woods, right? So you should reject the fairy tale. If you thought it was going to be a happy one, it's not. This is not a. He's not a friend to these two little the children in this image. He's like in that fairy tale, he's going to leave them in the woods. So it's a critique. It's saying that Andrew Johnson doesn't actually care. So in 1866, the radical Republicans, they gained control of Congress, right? And like I said, just to repeat, they wanted equality between African Americans and whites. And that's why they were called radical. And so these radical Republicans gained control of Congress and took over Reconstruction from President Johnson. And they expanded the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was a government group that helped former slaves as well as poor whites by providing them with clothing, food, medical care, equipment, employment. And most importantly, they provided education. They opened schools up throughout the South for African Americans so they could actually finally learn how to read and do numbers and get an education that they had craved for so long, but they hadn't been able to get previously. The Radical Republicans, they also passed a Civil Rights Act in 1866, and this one granted African Americans citizenship and made black codes illegal. And black codes were laws that discriminated against African Americans because of their race. And there's also the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This one stated that former Confederate states would be occupied by the military, by Union troops. American troops would occupy the cities and the countryside in the South and make sure that the African Americans were protected and make sure that the former Confederate states were obeying the laws of the United States, and that the southern states, would have to meet very strict criteria in order to be readmitted. And the Radical Republicans also attempted to impeach Andrew Johnson, the president. They considered him doing a poor job and not fulfilling the obligations of his office. And he actually really came close to being impeached, the closest any president has ever come to being impeached. He came within one vote of being removed from office. But by one vote, he was saved and was able to serve out the rest of his term, but he wasn't really able to do anything. So here on the right is a cartoon from the era, and it shows how the Union Army had to get between former Confederate soldiers and Southern whites and African Americans. There was a lot of tension in the South. And so the Union Army had to play a defensive role and diffuse some of the tension, or at least try and prevent it from becoming violent. And here's a cartoon that shows you the attitude that many people in the South and some people even in the North had towards something like the Freedmen's Bureau. You can see it's a negative portrayal of African Americans. It's a disgusting portrayal. It's a really horrible portrayal. And it's basically saying that they were just draining the government of money and that these former slaves were lazy and not wanting to work. When in fact, these African Americans, they wanted to farm, they wanted to succeed, they wanted to support their families and have their own land. But again, this was a popular image of the former slaves at the time. And it's an unfortunate part of our history that's how they were viewed. And here's a ticket to an actual ticket to get into the U.S. Senate to watch the impeachment trial for Andrew Johnson, the president. And this was a very popular ticket back then. It was very much in demand, but again, he was not actually impeached. So besides that, there were some important changes to the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution had supported slavery with things like the 3/5 Compromise, the fugitive slave portion of the Constitution that allowed for runaway slaves to be reclaimed and forced back into slavery, and the compromise that had said that the slave trade would not be banned until 1808. So some very important changes were made to the Constitution in the years following the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865 and ultimately took effect in 1866, this officially ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, which was added in 1868, it made citizens of all persons citizens born or naturalized in the United States. That meant that all 4 million former slaves who had been born in the United States automatically became citizens. And there's no question that they were American citizens at this time after this was passed. It also granted equal protection of the law, and this is going to become really important in the years coming, in the years following. Even today, when groups claim that they are not that they're being discriminated against and not receiving equal protection of the law, this amendment is still important to this day, and basically meant that no state could deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And this amendment is going to play a big part in a lot of civil rights cases, in racial cases, in cases about sexuality, sexual orientation, about gender discrimination. And if you look at most Supreme Court cases today, they're connected in some way to the 14th Amendment. Then you had the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870. And this protected the right to vote for all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, simply put, this meant that all men were able to vote. However, there's a pretty big loophole that says that even though you can't be denied the right to vote based on race or former state servitude, state as a slave, states are going to find some loopholes to prevent African Americans from being able to vote, unfortunately. So here is a cartoon, another cartoon, and it shows a positive portrayal of African Americans. And you'll notice Abraham Lincoln in the bottom, in the center, right here. And families, black families who were thriving under their newly freed state of emancipation. And here's a picture, a very famous picture or drawing that shows African American men taking advantage of their now constitutionally protected right to vote. And speaking of African Americans during Reconstruction, many African Americans during Reconstruction achieved so much in just a 12-year period of time. But it's often overlooked, unfortunately, in our history. So we're going to look at this more closely. So African Americans, they achieved a lot in those 12 years. It often gets disregarded or covered up, or just not mentioned. So the Southern population in the physical environment in the South was devastated, and this is where most African Americans lived. You had some free blacks in the South, but mostly African Americans down there had formerly been slaves. And about 4 million now, because of the Civil War, were free, and they were competing with their former owners and with otherwise specifically poor whites for limited resources. Many African Americans thought one of the first things they wanted to do was reunite with their families. You know, if they'd been separated through being sold, or if they had to run away, or they attempted to escape. So because of that, they attempted to seek out their family members wherever they might have been, which was very difficult since they didn't have good records yet back then. Other African Americans, such as Hiram Revels, they were elected to state and national offices, and Hiram Revels was the first African American. He's in this picture on the left. He's the first African American to serve in the United States Congress from Mississippi. And education, as I mentioned earlier, also became a priority. The Freedmen's Bureau had established schools throughout the South, and in these classes you had grandmothers sitting alongside their grandchildren learning letters and learning how to really use math, finally being able to read the Bible. You know, they'd heard all these stories from the Bible for so long, and they finally were learning to read those stories on their own. And the Freedmen's Bureau, again, played a critical role in that. And we even have universities that were established, such as Howard University, that were created to educate those African Americans who had been denied an opportunity for a higher level education. Howard University is the second oldest black college in the United States, historically black college. It was founded in 1867. And here is a picture of the group of some of the first senators and representatives that were African American, some of the first ones ever elected to the U.S. Congress. Here is a school, one of the Freedmen schools, and the logo of Howard University. So, as I was saying, Howard University is one of the oldest colleges, specifically for African Americans. Is And another one's Lincoln College in Pennsylvania. Many African Americans, since they had been slaves, they knew how to work the land. That is what they knew. That is what how they wanted to support their families. So many of them became sharecroppers or tenant farmers, as you can see here. And that what this meant was that they would have to rent their land and rent tools from their former masters. So this created a very interesting situation in the South, where former slaves were now independently working with their masters, um, but the former masters would still try and control them. And one of the ways that they did was overcharging for land and overcharging for tools, making sure that the African Americans were always in debt to them. And in fact, most African American farmers, these sharecroppers and tenant farmers, they really rarely ever made enough money to buy their own land and be independent. So again, here's a picture on the left of Hiram Revels, again, the first African American to serve in Congress from the state of Mississippi. And in this picture that I showed you just a couple seconds, 30 seconds ago, a minute ago, he is off on the far left, along with several other of the first African Americans to serve in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives. And again, this is a picture of one of the freedmen's schools. You see all those children there, a few adults, possibly teenagers, who again were attending these schools. And these schools were packed throughout the South, and a lot of women came from northern states to the South to teach in these schools. And like I said, this is Howard University, founded in 1867, was named after General Howard, who was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. And here is a picture taken after the Civil War. These are actually sharecroppers who were in the cotton fields picking cotton, just as many of them had done when slavery was allowed. So many things had changed for African Americans, but some things like hard labor on farms were sadly very much the same, despite the Civil War. So some of the problems that arose during Reconstruction, as I mentioned before, we had some groups of whites, former slave owners, who were working to limit the freedoms of African Americans during this time period. We had black codes, which I mentioned earlier. These were state and town laws that limited or tried to limit the rights of African Americans, not allowing them to live in certain areas, requiring them to have a job, forcing them to walk in the streets instead of on the sidewalk. A lot of very nitpicky laws that could cause African Americans, law-abiding African Americans, to be accused and charged with crimes. Unfortunately, then we have the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which was organized in 1866, and they terrorized and killed African Americans throughout the South. Former Confederates, former Confederate soldiers and generals and leaders also eventually regained political and economic power at the state level and local level, and even at the national level. Northerners, those who had lived in the states that had won the Civil War, they actually became less concerned about the fate of former slaves in Reconstruction overall. It was exhausting. This was a very time-consuming and money-consuming task, and they just got tired of dealing with it and all the problems that arose. And it was a very difficult time, and they just got tired of dealing with it. They wanted it to end. And the Republican Party, which had led the charge for Reconstruction, the Republican Party of Lincoln, the party that had the radical Republicans under President Ulysses S. Grant in the 1870s, had to deal with a lot of scandals. And this wore them out. This caused a lot of distractions. So people turned away from Reconstruction and the issues in the South. And, you know, a lot of they turned away from the issues that were affecting former slaves in southern states, and instead they were focusing on these other scandals. And again, it wore people out. And the Supreme Court also made several rulings about laws, and some of the laws passed by Congress, that allowed states to restrict rights of African Americans. Basically, it said that laws that segregated and discriminate against African Americans were constitutional, and that's something we're going to look at continuously through this class. Um, and here is a cartoon, right? Again, showing how certain groups like the KKK and other groups like the White League would work together to limit the opportunities and the lives of African Americans. So Reconstruction finally came to an end as part of the presidential election of 1876, when Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden was one vote shy of winning the Electoral College. So therefore, he was one vote shy of becoming president. So supporters of Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes worked out a deal with the Democrats. And this deal was that Hayes would get enough votes to win the Electoral College and the presidency. And in return, Hayes, as president, would withdraw all remaining Union troops in the former Confederate states. And this effectively ended Reconstruction because those soldiers were not in those former Confederate states to enforce the law. They weren't there to protect the rights and the bodies of African Americans. So this led to Southern states basically running their own affairs without constant federal intervention. And so many of the accomplishments of African Americans at the state and local level, and even at the national level, quickly disappeared or were forgotten. And the forgotten redeemers, as a lot of these white former Confederates who seized power, these redeemers, as they were known, quickly tried to erase the accomplishments of African Americans. So when these Confederates, these former slave owners, and these Southern whites who came back into power, they tried to purposely erase those accomplishments of African Americans and make people forget that they even accomplished anything. And it's important that we know we can't they can't truly fully erase history, and we have discovered and remembered those things despite what they tried to do. And we can't forget some of these accomplishments because of things like the constitutional amendments, the other things like the establishment of black colleges like Howard University and similar organizations that arose out of the Freedmen's Bureau. They continued to exist despite what the Southern whites tried to do after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. These all continued to exist, and they played critical roles in the fight for civil rights. And as soon as African Americans gained their freedom, even before they were free from slavery, they were fighting for their rights, fighting for civil rights. And this is a fight that they're going to continue even to the present day. And we'll keep talking about this issue in class and throughout the year. So thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next lesson.